The exhausted woman lay in bed, pondering the fate that awaited her children once she left this world. The war between the empires of Simon and Barut had dragged on for a year and a half, and a simple commoner turned mercenary played a significant role. The emperor wanted to bestow upon Zester a high status, but he faced several issues in doing so. Despite Kasia Ruberno being considered the most desirable bride in the empire, renowned for her beauty and outstanding lineage, she married the man who had become known as the emperor's hound baron. She had journeyed to the lands of Greece, hoping for a happy marriage, but the baron constantly left her at the estate to engage in ongoing military conflicts. He was not a good husband. For all 10 years, Zester never once spoke words of love. Only their children, Rael and Lucy, brought her joy, and it pained her incredibly to see them sitting by her bedside, crying. A month earlier, the Baron had left to defend the territory of Vish, and Kasia wondered whether he would have stayed if he had known she had less than a month to live. She felt he probably wouldn't have. Watching the servants and her children, who couldn't hold back their tears, she reflected on the fact that she never truly lived for herself. She pondered whether she would have been happier had she lived without any concerns. The door swung open, and there on the threshold stood Zester, who immediately fell to his knees beside the bed, asking what she wanted. They spoke about how Kasia could not ask for lavish gifts, knowing how hard he worked for money, but the Baron promised he would do everything. The woman spoke of her desires, then handed over a paper, asking him to sign it. After doing so, she coughed violently and passed away. Zester watched as the servants scurried anxiously around the Baroness, hoping she was still alive. He tore up the paper she had earlier handed him, adamant about not placing his signature on it. Kasia opened her eyes, wondering if, after death, one goes to heaven in their original form. She observed herself, looking as she did about 10 years earlier. She then folded her hands in prayer and waited. But time passed, and the Lord did not come. To her astonishment, she saw Zester asleep beside her on the bed where she sat. Startled, she fell, struggling to comprehend what was happening and wondering if she had to go through hell to reach heaven. Kasia stared at her waking husband and began to shout, tears streaming down her face, that even though he might be handsome, she did not want to see him and wondered if he would haunt her even after death. A blanket fell over the girl to cover her bare body. Zester put on a robe and left the room, leaving his wife alone. Kasia's words about hating her husband clearly left a mark on his soul, leading him to misinterpret what the former Ruberno said when it was already too late. The Baroness realized she had been taken back in time by 10 years, to the day after their wedding night, and regretted that she had to relive that nightmarish life. When Kasia was still young, Zester distinguished himself in the Imperial War. She didn't know the details, but the outcome was clear. Providal arranged an engagement between Kasia and the newly minted Baron with Count Ruberno, meaning she would inevitably marry into the Grease family. Memories of the previous day flashed through the Baroness's mind, how the man had told her she did not arouse him and intended to leave. The young lady had to stop him, asking him to consider her reputation and spend the night with her. In her previous life, she had marked that day as one of the 5 worst days at the Grease estate. Pushing these thoughts aside, Kasia approached a mirror and looked at her long hair. When she was bedridden with an incurable disease, she had short hair. In the days leading up to her death, their lands were struck by a severe famine. At the same time, in a neighboring state, they began producing wigs, and the women of Greece started selling their hair to feed their families. Recalling the horrors that might await her, she decided to radically change her life and do whatever she pleased, to indulge in luxury and laziness. Once again, the young woman pondered how her husband neglected her, indifferent as she was dying, and wondered if he had signed divorce papers after her death. Kasia would have filed for divorce in this life too, but fond memories of their children made her postpone that decision indefinitely. In the past, the marriage had caused the Baroness pain. At first, she thought it was normal, but later, when she realized the problem lay in their relationship, she felt awkward interacting with other residents of the estate. Kasia fully realized their relationship was unhealthy when, upon hearing they were expecting a child, Zester responded with restrained gratitude. However, she now planned to change her life, not shouldering all the mansion's responsibilities and not chaining herself to the Grease estate. But before making any plans, she intended to take a short nap. Kasia didn't have a concrete plan of action, but she was certain it revolved around confidence and holding her head high when speaking to her husband. Just as she was about to set off in the desired direction, she encountered the still young butler, Paul, at her room's threshold. The man courteously bowed and introduced himself, offering a house tour and to assign a suitable maid. However, the Baroness expressed her hope to handle those details later as she needed to meet her husband at that moment. Paul then escorted her, who was unfamiliar with the mansion's layout, straight to Zester's office. Without knocking, she entered with pride and sat opposite Grease, declaring her unwillingness to handle all the household's organizational matters. She also voiced her hope that he wouldn't demand any marital duties. Memories flooded her mind, recalling how she had worked herself to the bone even when no one asked her to, likely leading to her incurable illness. To Kasha's surprise, the Baron showed no objection. He noted that she could do as she pleased but remarked that she seemed like a completely different woman than the one he had known just a day before. For him, it was also a revelation how freely she expressed her thoughts. He was slightly taken aback that she hadn't voiced immediately what she disliked, instead forcing herself into intimacy. Kasha then clarified that she had not previously been intimate, which made it difficult for her to decipher her feelings. She added that she hadn't expected to despise the physical aspect of their relationship. But after that night, she found it distasteful. The Baron was taken aback. Her words pierced him like sharp arrows. However, he managed to compose himself and mentioned he would discuss her wishes with the butler. As soon as the door closed, Zester couldn't hold back. He inked a blotch on the documents and tore up the vexing paper. As the eldest daughter of Count Ruberno, Kasha was the center of attention at any event. She was like an angel. Now, she saw herself as nothing special, a mere aristocrat, married off to a lower nobleman, a former commoner, a mercenary. All she had retained was her status and an inviolable position. Zester recalled their first meeting when Kasha had smiled and vowed to strive hard to bridge the gaps in skills and elevate their lands. He remembered how, that night, she had stopped him, asking him to claim her. He pondered how he had tried not to mess things up and what his wife had told him in the morning. He was in despair. Zester was still reflecting on his wife's reaction to the night they spent together, uncertain whether to apologize or pretend everything was fine. When Paul entered the room, wishing to discuss the delegation of certain responsibilities to Kasha, the Baron then informed him that everything would remain as it was for now, as Kasha, coming from a count's household, would need time to adjust. The butler expressed genuine surprise at the Baron's unusually long speech and his evident concern for Kasha. Nevertheless, he decided not to dwell on it. After clarifying some issues related to land checks, he was about to leave when the Baron called out to him. Paul saw the indecision in his master's eyes and thought that perhaps, for the first time in his 2 years working at this estate, they might have a personal conversation. Zester inquired if Paul had a wife and learned that his spouse had been frail and passed away before he began his service in this house. The Baron then conveyed that he needed assistance with a very delicate matter, explaining that after their intimate night, Kasha had said she hated him, leaving Zester feeling devastated. Paul tried to gauge the severity of the situation, pondering the seriousness of Kasha personally addressing her feelings to her husband. He responded that he couldn't help in this regard, as it wasn't within his purview and it would be inappropriate for him to delve into the intimate details of his master's life. However, the butler noted that an issue of such vital importance required an urgent solution and suggested seeking assistance from someone else. He mentioned Florent Rosaline, a woman who had become renowned as the best courtesan in the capital, earning sums beyond the wildest dreams of ordinary citizens. This woman was intelligent, well-versed in the humanities, and possessed a physique comparable to an aristocrat. Eventually, it wasn't clients choosing her but rather her selecting them. Among the nobility, she became known as Lady Florent, even though the title lady traditionally belonged only to born aristocrats. Paul expressed his concerns about Baron Grease's reputation but nonetheless proposed discreetly contacting Rosaline for assistance, to which Zester agreed. Shortly after, the butler discovered that Lady Florent was currently in their hometown and managed to secure an appointment with her. However, the Baron was now plagued with new worries. If rumors spread, Kasha would undoubtedly be shocked, and something would need to be done about it. In the end, they decided it was best to keep everything a secret and, if any misunderstandings arose, explain everything to the Baroness. Paul politely knocked on Kasha's door, and when he received permission to enter, he was taken aback by what he saw. Kasha lay with her head dangling off the bed, staring at the entrance. Paul initially thought he might have entered at an inopportune time, but after closing the door and asking for permission to re-enter, her demeanor remained unchanged. The butler's mind raced, wondering if the young lady was so profoundly affected by her intimacy with Zester that she now behaved in this unusual manner, making the matter of the master's sexual enlightenment seem even more urgent. However, when Paul inquired about her concerns, he was surprised to see a joyful smile spread across the Baroness's face. Kasha explained that everything was fine, she was merely enjoying some free time. She spoke about the pleasure of lying down, doing nothing, emphasizing the importance of self-care even in youth, and suggesting that Paul should also take breaks and not exhaust himself. The man was taken aback, not expecting such wisdom from a 17-year-old girl. He soon relayed the purpose of his visit. He wished to discuss the matter of a personal maidservant. The butler's plan was to rotate maids to assist the Baroness, training anyone she took a liking to immediately. However, their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A girl introduced herself as Vita, expressing her desire to greet the new lady of the house. Paul attempted to reprimand her for the intrusion, but Kasia showed interest in the identity of the visitor. The young lady was already well aware of the identity of the visitor, Vita Berkeley, Zester's childhood friend who had entered the estate as a maid on the day he was appointed Baron. Kasia then invited the guest in, and with a sweet smile, Vita introduced herself, launching into incessant chatter and quickly shifting to a casual tone. Kasia politely responded to the ramblings, all the while reflecting on Vita's audacity, who seemed oblivious to the boundaries between nobility and commoners. She recalled how Vita constantly instructed the maids and treated the Baroness as if she were a close friend, even trying to advise on how to interact with the servants. Attempts to discuss this with her husband were futile. The man trusted Vita, asked for understanding, and insisted there was no reason to suspect her of any wrongdoing. Kasia listened to her husband and endured Vita's antics. Now, she asked Berkeley to leave her alone, citing fatigue, and began to reminisce about how she had to tolerate Vita for 2 years. Only when she was pregnant with Rael, and faced the threat of a miscarriage, was the Baroness able to banish the source of her stress. Moreover, there was an instance when she heard a noise from her husband's bedroom, a memory that still haunted her. She now regretted not immediately suspecting an affair. Lady Florence sat before the Baron, unsure of how to begin instructing someone like Zester. After Lady Florence listened to the Baron's account of his night with his wife, she was taken aback. However, she soon composed herself and asked a clarifying question. From what she heard, the courtesan felt the urge to smoke. The idea that one should use their mouth during intimacy was beyond her comprehension. She continued to explain that in her view, sexual relations could be described as animal mating, not the beautiful physical union often glorified in pulp novels. Rosaline took a pen and sketched a schematic of the female body. Even from the innocent drawing, Zester became visibly flustered as she continued to explain that no woman would appreciate a man reducing intimacy to mere thoughtless thrusts. Then, on the illustration, she highlighted specific parts of the body, emphasizing that the Baron shouldn't neglect them. The Baron was quite embarrassed and didn't grasp this animalistic behavior. The woman's stress level gradually increased as she heard about Grie's belief that it was sinful to touch his wife, hoping that the Baroness still had some patience left. For Kasia, time passed peacefully and without concern. Her only annoyance was the company of Vita, who endeavored to accompany her everywhere, chattering about anything and everything. The Baroness wasn't jealous now, but she hoped to catch Berkeley in secret meetings with her husband, so she would no longer have to endure her company. During a walk, the two women spotted a female silhouette emerging from Zester's study. Vita immediately decided to identify the visitor. Without hesitation, she approached, grabbed the woman by the shoulder, and began bombarding her with impertinent questions. Kasia had to rush over to defuse the situation caused by her husband's friend. The Baroness ordered Vita to let the guest go, but instead, she expressed her desire to see the visitor's face. Berkeley aggressively pulled away the woman's scarf, and upon seeing her face, began accusing her of being a prostitute. The insults towards Lady Florence did not cease. Vita accused her of being money-hungry and unscrupulous and demanded an explanation for her visit to the Baron. Rosaline wouldn't tolerate such behavior. She stated bluntly that she didn't consider Vita as someone who could afford to treat her that way. She then turned to the Baroness and mentioned that she hadn't intended to stay long, but given the circumstances, she couldn't ignore the mistress of the estate and introduced herself. Lady Florence informed them that the butler had summoned her to assist with a particular issue, and, despite the circumstances, was pleased to meet the Baroness. After Kasia assured her that everything was fine and she had no questions for the guest, Rosaline planned to leave peacefully. However, it seemed that Vita wasn't going to let her go that easily. Kasia was horrified by Vita's behavior. Ignoring all social etiquette, Vita had grabbed Lady Florence's hair, preventing her from leaving the estate. In response, Rosaline couldn't stand idle. She retaliated by pulling Vita's braid while a flustered Baroness watched the chaos unfold. The noblewoman then attempted to separate the two, but she was unexpectedly grabbed by her dress. She nearly fell, but her husband, alerted by the noise, caught her. Kasia was struggling to make sense of the unfolding events. She couldn't comprehend how things had escalated to such pandemonium. When Zester asked if she was all right, the Baroness realized she was completely overwhelmed. Grease could only watch in astonishment and didn't dare intervene until his wife took charge. She raised her voice and ordered Berkeley to release Lady Rosaline. When Vita attempted to retort, the aristocrat didn't mince words in reprimanding her. Sitting straight up on Paul, Vita listened as Kasia recounted how she had tried to be kind to her because the Baron considered her family. However, given such behavior, as the mistress of the house, she couldn't tolerate it any longer. Every word seemed to deeply impact the frightened Vita. By challenging the Baroness's authority in such a manner, she had brought herself to the brink of being shown the door. Berkeley, struggling to hold back tears, looked at Zester and pleaded for help. Paul tried to reason with her, urging her to obey the lady and return to her room. Meanwhile, Lady Florent observed the unfolding events, taking note of Kasia's comments about her husband's reactions to women's visits and the Baron's attempts to explain. Despite her lady's command, Vita was reluctant to leave. She continued to plead with her childhood friend for help. However, to her surprise, he sided with his wife and simply asked why she wasn't obeying the order. Zester stood by the window when Paul approached him, suggesting a conversation with the lady about Lady Florent's visit, suspecting she might have misunderstood the situation. The man responded that he would speak to her himself about the matter and immediately headed to her room for clarification. He knocked and entered. His thoughts immediately drifted to his wife's light attire, but when she rebuked him, all he could muster was an apology. Kasia pondered the fact that the Baron had come to her himself and, moreover, had taken her side during the dispute. To keep the conversation going, she asked why he felt guilty. The Baron began to explain, but the girl expressed confusion. She didn't believe anything had occurred that warranted an apology. Kasia didn't care about Zester's intentions when he invited Lady Florent. She felt he didn't need to justify himself. In her eyes, the only reason for an apology was Vita's behavior, who seemed to overstep her boundaries. Kasia was indifferent that the Baron himself hadn't informed her about his friend. Instead, she had been informed by Paul. However, in the household hierarchy, right after the master should be his spouse. Everyone should respect her and treat her with dignity, not looking down on her. Consequently, the Baroness was justifiably upset about the incident. Zester was dejected afterward. His wife's words, expressing indifference to his personal life and asserting it was solely his decision to invite whomever he wished, kept echoing in his mind. No matter how many times the Baron tried to explain himself, the outcome was the same. Kasia would cut him off mid-sentence, reiterating that it didn't matter to her. Now, Zester sat in his study, feeling despondent. He couldn't stop thinking about what had transpired, and even Paul's visit didn't snap him out of his slump. Initially, the butler had been in high spirits, and judging by the lady's behavior, he had assumed their conversation had gone well. However, he now realized that things weren't so straightforward. When Paul couldn't elicit a response from the Baron, he decided not to dwell on it and simply relayed Kasia's request that her husband look after Vita. Without waiting for a response, Paul chose to leave. The lady sat alone, genuinely trying to relish her solitude. She indulged in some pastries with tea and admired the scenery outside the window. The butler was pleased to see his mistress in good spirits, and when he informed her of a letter from Lord Havelon, her mood seemed to lift even higher. The Baroness read the message and pondered how long it had been since they'd last communicated. In her previous life, she had never spoken to him in all the 10 years she'd resided at the estate. Now, Kasia intended to make up for lost time and planned to invite Lord Havelon to stay. She informed Paul that the Viscount might likely set out as soon as he read the letter. The lady was relaxing in her room when her husband entered, wishing to discuss a matter concerning a land inspection. Initially, as the Baroness had informed on her second day at the estate, she hadn't planned on participating in any such activities. However, after some consideration, she agreed to accompany her husband, but only after she had met with her friend. Zester didn't object, and it seemed he wanted to discuss something else, but his wife apparently wasn't in the mood for conversation and chose to go to bed instead. Outside the estate, in anticipation of an esteemed guest's arrival, Baron Grease stood alongside his wife, with a few servants nearby. Kasia was excited, as Viscount Havelon was a close friend she had known for quite some time. She recounted that when they first met, she had no idea of Draen's noble lineage, since his manner of speaking was coarse and not at all reminiscent of someone from a distinguished background. However, the more the Baroness spoke of her friend, the darker Zester's expression grew. He couldn't help but harbor some doubts. The former Miss Ruberno clearly disapproved of her husband's train of thought and voiced her displeasure. She was incensed by such suspicions, and only the distant sound of horses neighing kept her from more severe reproaches. The carriage arrived, and seeing the guest, Zester couldn't help but reflect on the stark contrast between himself and true nobility. To the war hero, it seemed that he and the Viscount were from different worlds. If the guest could be compared to a majestic deer, Zester felt like a wild boar stumbling upon a home on a winter day. Drain greeted the estate's master politely, but there was a clear lack of sincerity in his gesture. He then expressed his desire to greet his dear friend, whom he promptly embraced. Zester couldn't bear this and grabbed the audacious man's hand. He found it intolerable for any man to get so close to his wife. Kasia explained her guest's lack of restraint by mentioning that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Nevertheless, she reminded the Viscount that she was no longer the daughter of a count but the lady of the house, and he should hence exhibit politeness. While it couldn't be said that Grise was satisfied with the outcome, he had to reconcile with the fact that Drain did apologize. As the old friends sat together in the house, the Baroness reflected on not having seen this face for a long 10 years. Her thoughts were interrupted when the man began lamenting about how his dear friend was sent to such a dreadful place. The Viscount's thoughtless words gradually irked Kasia. She disliked hearing her territories compared to slums and unwarranted resentment towards her fate. Subtly, the conversation shifted to how Viscount Havelon disapproved of Count Ruberno's actions, deeming them selfish for marrying his daughter off to someone like the Baron. Moreover, the war hero, Drain, didn't seem like a good man either. However, deciding not to dwell on the topic further, the man chose to present a gift, which immediately delighted Kasia at first glance. Kasia was mesmerized as she looked at the small, shimmering gemstone encased in a jar. Drain mentioned that it was a product of his father's endeavors in the magical industry and handed it to her. The gift left her astounded. Historically, it was believed that in ancient times, there were mages who practiced magic. However, over time, they vanished. Legend has it that these mages felt a sense of guilt towards humanity and dispersed their magic among gemstones, allowing its essence to reach subsequent generations. The Havelon lands weren't densely populated, but they were abundant with countless gemstones, which had now merely become rocks. Yet, the former Viscount assembled scholars and embarked on a study, eventually pioneering magical engineering, which harnessed the energy of gemstones in combination with machinery. Kasia recalled that in the past, her father swiftly chose to ally with Havelon. Power-hungry entities set their sights on the Viscount's territories, leading to a war. Count Ruberno sent a plea for assistance to Grise. The Baron responded, leaving for the battlefront without informing his wife. Zester played a pivotal role in securing victory. Upon returning home, he presented Kasia with a large, high-quality gemstone. It was believed that its value would skyrocket as the magical industry progressed. However, Kasia was distraught and harbored resentment towards her father, who she felt had treated the war hero, Zester, as a mere commoner. However, Count Ruberno genuinely believed in success, but everything faltered when utilizing the gemstones that harbored intricate magic. Kasia's memories were interrupted by Paul's voice, announcing that lunch was ready and that the Baron awaited them with their guests. The Baroness marveled at the lavish spread on the table, listening intently as the chef listed the dishes, reflecting on the efforts that must have gone into such a feast. Drain noted Kasia's surprise at the banquet and deduced that the Baron might not be concerned about his wife's dietary preferences and might not be offering her familiar food. The chef began to apologize, but Kasia sternly addressed the Viscount, asserting he should be aware of the fertility of these lands. She expressed that while it's customary for aristocrats to hold feasts, it's pointless when people are suffering. Even if the Baron indulged in such extravagances, she would be disappointed. If he tried to pamper her in such a manner, she'd promptly decline. She then turned to Lucas, reassuring him that he wasn't at fault and didn't need to apologize, recalling with fondness the fish pie he had made for her arrival, a testament to his culinary talent. A chagrined Viscount Havelon listened as his friend chastised him and praised the simple yet delicious dishes. He subsequently apologized for his sharp remarks. The matter was resolved, and both parties genuinely understood their missteps before continuing their meal. Baron Grise watched as his wife, accompanied by Viscount Havelon, went for a stroll. He deeply disliked that the Viscount seemed to be taking his place, but there was little he could do about it. He took solace in the fact that Kasia was his wife. Observing his wife's attire, the Baron asked Paul why she was dressed so lightly and learned it was likely due to the climate differences. It turned out the south was much warmer, and its winter couldn't compare to the harsh weather in Grise. Grise decided to buy a warm coat for Kasia and ordered the butler to send it as a gift with a note. However, the butler insisted that the Baron should personally present the gift, adding that after their wedding night, the couple should spend more nights together. This comment deeply embarrassed Zester, and even after Paul clarified he meant simply sharing a bed, not intimacy, the Baron's face remained as red as a tomato. Viscount Havlon tried to apologize to Kasia. After his remarks about the dinner, she had largely started to ignore him. The fact that Kasia sided with her husband over an old friend upset Drayan. Kasia's words, reminding him that she was no longer Count Ruberno's daughter, and that it was impolite to criticize the food in her house, further disconcerted the young man. The Baroness expressed her concern about their friend who had inherited a title but still behaved immaturely, neglecting considerations of reputation and consequences. To Drayan, it seemed that Kasia had matured considerably. Wanting to change the topic, Kasia inquired about the length of Drayan's stay. He surprised her by revealing he would be there for about 2 weeks and assured her that he had taken care of the estates, and there was nothing to worry about. Havlon then pulled out several pieces of paper from his inner pocket. They had inscriptions related to the gemstones of Manwha, and he needed help deciphering them. Despite hiring scholars, progress in understanding these inscriptions was slow, mainly because they were skeptical about the magic embedded in the gemstones and thus weren't fully invested in the task. This was precisely why the Viscount had approached Kasia for assistance. Kasia quickly understood the first sentence engraved on the gifted stone, but the subsequent one made her ponder. She speculated that this might be why the magical department failed. Understanding the true purpose of the gemstone was immensely challenging. Still, even Drayan was enthusiastic about this project and believed they would succeed. Kasia didn't try to persuade her friend otherwise, but deep down, she felt the magical industry would collapse. Her primary goal was to ensure that in this lifetime, Zester wouldn't bring a gemstone back from the war. Kasia paced the dimly lit room. It was late, and she was reflecting on the land inspection that hadn't taken place. Her thoughts wandered to Mrs. Margaret, and while she didn't want to exert herself as she had in her past life, she was determined to help the local residents. She felt the need to speak with Zester and reschedule the land check for another day. But as soon as she opened the door, she was slightly startled by the tall silhouette of her husband right at the threshold. Immediately, the man apologized, asking her where she was headed. He was quite surprised when she mentioned she was coming to see him. Upon entering the room, a painting almost fell onto Kasia, which Zester managed to catch just in time. After he apologized, Kasia assured him it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't the first time he couldn't control his strength, which surprised him with her candid remark. The Baroness invited her husband to sit and began discussing how she hadn't anticipated the Viscount's visit to be so prolonged. Consequently, waiting for him to leave before inspecting the land would be imprudent. She then asked Zester why he decided to visit her so late. Jumping to conclusions, she presumed it was for intimacy and began undressing. However, Zester quickly interjected, explaining he simply wanted to sleep beside her. For Kasia, this was a rather surprising statement, but she didn't object and suggested they go to bed. To fill the ensuing awkward silence, she initiated a conversation. The Baroness mentioned that according to rumors, Vita remained cautious and kept a low profile. Zester responded by saying that it was Kasia whom Vita had offended, and he was giving her the opportunity to sort things out with Berkeley. He also detected the undertones in Kasia's words and clarified that his relationship with Vita was entirely different from what she presumed. She humbly accepted this. Seizing the moment, Zester informed her that suitable clothing would be delivered the next day so she wouldn't feel cold. However, by then, she had already fallen asleep. Thoughts swirled in Zester's mind about how Kasia seemed angelic and how he was on the verge of madness when, unexpectedly, her leg draped over his sturdy frame, catching him off guard. Before settling down to sleep himself, he leaned over his wife, contemplating that for a long and happy life, he would sleep beside her until the end of their days. Kasia, along with her husband, strolled through the bustling streets of the small town, delightfully inspecting the lands. She stopped by pens and stalls, commented on their conditions, and offered developmental suggestions. She praised handmade jewelry and was charmed by the animals, earning the respect of the local inhabitants. Listening to his wife's insights, Zester could only think that despite being a baron for several years, he lacked such a wealth of knowledge and was inept at assessing situations. Soon, he suggested they return to the estate. However, Kasia wanted to visit one more house first. As they approached the fence, a middle-aged woman rushed out, expressing surprise at such a visit. With a smile, Kasia remarked on how wonderful the town was and that she'd decided to visit the woman's home. Having been drawn by a delightful aroma, she expressed regret for missing lunch and promised to visit again someday. Tears welled up in the Baroness's eyes. She remembered her past life and the possibility that this woman could succumb to exhaustion trying to feed her 5 children. Kasia took Margaret's hands, noticing their swollen state, and asked with concern why they were like that. She assumed the woman had been overworking herself. Kasia then slipped a gold ring onto Margaret's finger, wishing to offer some form of support. The woman tried her best to decline the generous gift, but Kasia chose to take her husband's hand, indicating it was time to leave. Only then did Margaret relent, bowing deeply in gratitude for her kindness. However, as they started to leave, they heard a man's shout, asking the Baroness to wait. He introduced himself as James Cromwell and mentioned he had a proposal. He explained that he was planning to start a business but lacked the necessary funds and thus was hoping for the couple's support. Zester was livid, and Margaret too admonished James, accusing him of rudeness and demanding an immediate apology to the lady. But James persisted, urging them first to examine his work. When Kasia saw the finely stitched hairpiece in Cromwell's hands, she immediately took it for a closer look, while her husband continued berating the man. The Baron was ready to draw his sword when his wife called out to him. She had meanwhile put on the wig, much to everyone's amazement, and she praised the craftsman for his exemplary work. The Baroness then explained that noblewomen couldn't change their hairstyles on a whim. However, many considered cutting or dyeing their hair, and such a business might prove highly successful. Guided by this rationale, Kasia couldn't simply walk away, and thus offered to draft a contract with him. Kasia sat once again in her room, reflecting on the events of the day and contemplating her future. Would she perish from an unknown ailment? Or, by altering her way of life, could she avoid such a fate? She thought about how, in a past life, James might have come to Greece as well, but she wouldn't have recognized the unique value in wig-making back then. Her thoughts shifted to what could be done to improve their fortunes, especially since Rael would someday become the Baron. It would be far better if their lands were prosperous by then. The Baroness gazed at the papers spread before her, inscribed in an ancient language, trying to delve into the text and skipping over parts she had already deciphered. The next passage spoke of chances, remorse, God's mercy, and a new chapter, prompting her to ponder its potential meaning. However, her contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It seemed odd to Kasia to receive a late visit from her husband, especially 2 days in a row. But this time, Zester promptly draped a warm woolen coat over her shoulders. The Baron explained that the clothing brought from Ruberno didn't seem suitable for the local winter, so he took it upon himself to procure this coat. While it might not be as refined as those sold in the capital, it was warm. The Baroness's astonishment was difficult to articulate. It was hard for her to believe that something could prompt her husband to make such a gesture, as this behavior was entirely incongruent with what she remembered from her past life. Nonetheless, Kasia was genuinely touched by the gift and expressed her gratitude to her husband, promising to wear the coat. In her mind, she continued to marvel at the length of their conversation. She observed as Zester timidly approached the bed and lay under the blanket. Just as the Baroness was attempting to drift off to sleep, she was startled to hear her husband ask if he could hold her. Initially assuming he was seeking intimacy, she began to remove her nightgown, but he assured her that was not his intention. All Zester wanted to know at that moment was if he could embrace her while they slept. Kasia felt as if she were facing an entirely different man, a caring and emotionally expressive person capable of loving his wife and children. Nevertheless, she told him he need not ask for such small favors. After all, they were husband and wife. She then sank into his strong arms, feeling a sense of unexpected comfort and vulnerability, as she had never experienced such moments in her previous life. Slightly flustered, Kasia lay close to her husband, reminiscing about the first time she saw Zester and the impression he made on her. Back then, his appearance had struck her profoundly, the predatory, almost animalistic features, and his indifferent gaze. Every little detail about him seemed alluring. She had seen only the exterior of the man and knew nothing of his inner self, finding it hard to believe that he could be hesitant to embrace his wife. Now, as the Baroness pondered, she decided to voice a request. When Zester realized she was referring to their children, he became noticeably uneasy but continued to listen. Kasia's wish was for her husband to cherish, watch over, and play with their children, to be there when they are frightened by thunder and to ensure they grow up surrounded by their father's love. Zester responded that no one had ever asked such a thing of him, but he promised to be a good father. He might be awkward initially, but he would make every effort. The girl drifted back to sleep in an instant. This time, Zester didn't wonder for long. Instead, he held his wife tighter. As he was about to fall asleep himself, he heard her muttering. Tears glistened on Kasia's eyelashes, and he made out words about someone named Rael, that she loved and missed him. Zester couldn't know that Kasia was dreaming, a dream of a happy family with a mother, father, and 2 lovely children. In her sleep, she silently prayed to God for a good life with a loving husband and children. Awakening, Kasia realized her husband had already left, and the moments with a genuinely smiling Zester and their children were only a dream. Paul stood next to the Baron, disbelieving that he intended to leave the estate. He speculated that the Lord had quarreled with his wife while the man handed a paper to the butler, which bore a response to Vish. However, when Paul suggested reconsidering his decision, Zester declined, despite Paul's insistence that the compensation offered by the Viscount didn't match the risks involved. Zester couldn't shake off his wife's words from his mind. He believed that even if Kasia had a lover, it wasn't her fault. But all the Baron could think about was who this Rael might be. The man saw himself as pitiful and would rather head into battle. Still, Paul continued to urge him to talk with Kasia if something bothered him, as reconciling later would be much harder. Their conversation was interrupted by the furious arrival of Vida, whom the Baroness intended to dismiss that day. This time, Zester wasn't lenient and pointed out her behavior. However, this didn't concern Berkeley. She shouted in outrage that her friend had treated her in such a manner, shocking both the butler and the Baron. Zester asked Vida if she had possibly lost her mind to burst into the owner's office like that, screaming and throwing a tantrum. However, Berkeley was not fazed by his words. She began to complain about the Baroness throwing her out and how Zester was doing nothing about it. Vida was irate at Kasia's behavior, feeling picked on. She wanted to confront her childhood friend directly, but Paul decided to hold her back and scold her, to no avail. Vida yelled that her parents would be devastated when they found out, especially since they had asked Zester to look after her. Meanwhile, Grease was reminiscing about his childhood when he felt like a toy for a landowner's daughter, who grew up like a noblewoman in a small village. She was always bossing Zester around. Sometimes he had to give her piggyback rides. Other times he had to beat up boys who refused to listen to her. He constantly thought about how much he despised her but felt powerless to do anything. Even as they grew older, Vida continued to behave in the same manner. She might even declare a wish to practice kissing on him. When he objected, she would start crying. After such episodes, he would sit in his chamber, recalling how Mr. Berkeley had beaten him for upsetting his beloved daughter to the point of tears. And now, the Baron had grown tired of watching Vida. He was ready to personally throw her out when she tried to make him choose between her and his wife. At this display of disrespect, Paul headed to open the door to escort Vida out, only to run into Kasia. The Baroness wanted to speak with Zester, but seeing the scene, she mentioned she'd return later. The flustered man didn't know what to do initially but then raced to catch up with his wife. He embraced Kasia, pleading with her not to leave. He explained that she had misunderstood the situation again, expressing his fear that she'd avoid the conversation if he let her go. Only after she promised not to flee did he release her. With utmost sincerity, he said he would always choose her, eliciting a laugh for some reason. Nonetheless, he continued to assert that, regardless of the circumstances, he would always choose her. Following closely behind the Baron, a tearful Vida tried to manipulate the situation again upon hearing Zester's declaration. But he turned to her and warned her not to dare address him by his first name. Grease finally mustered the courage to break free from the chains of the past. Towering over Vida, he stated that he had already mentioned their relationship wasn't the same as before. When she crossed the line, he had no choice but to send her back from where she came. Vida couldn't believe how Zester had treated her. Every time she attempted to call him by his first name, he asserted that she no longer had the right to address him that way. Watching the entire ordeal, Kasia was also taken aback, especially when, in response to Berkeley's question, Zester expressed no regrets about his actions, even going so far as to say it was the best thing he had ever done in his life. However, as soon as the Baron turned around, his stern expression shifted to one of joy in an instant. He intended to leave the place with his wife. Vida now sat in the middle of the hallway, abandoned and left alone with her thoughts, banished from the estate. Kasia couldn't fathom what had prompted Zester to change so drastically, and why he had acted that way toward Berkeley, whom the Baroness had been prepared to tolerate for the next 2 years. Zester apologized for only dealing with Vida now, and inquired about the reason his wife had come to visit him. It turned out she wanted to request a tour, as Viscount Havelon was growing quite bored of being cooped up in the estate all the time. Without directly addressing the request, Zester decided to inform her of his imminent departure to assist Viscount Vish, who had sought help multiple times. Rumor had it that barbarians had seized part of Vish's lands, causing significant damage. Kasia recalled that in her past life, around this time, her husband truly went on his first business trip, after which they would have almost no time to see each other. She inquired about the compensation and was astounded to hear they would be paid 500,000 silver coins for such a task. This seemed a low amount, and Kasia tried to explain that Vish was a very wealthy nobleman and could afford to pay market value. Zester argued that to earn more, one must work harder and, for some reason, didn't see the need to request a higher reward. He was simply going into battle to ensure a better life for the people on his lands and to make sure his wife lacked nothing. He tried to provide Kasia with what he thought she was missing, but she couldn't understand what he was talking about since she never gave him a reason to think that way. Then, the Baron mentioned that she was missing someone named Rael, and Kasia, alarmed, asked how he came to know that name. He didn't hide the fact that he heard it when she was asleep. However, he asserted that he wouldn't step back and would treat her as best he could until she forgot about the other man. But Kasia stated that she would never forget him, saying she hadn't met anyone else as kind and good as him. Moreover, he was handsome, just like his father. Kasia continued talking about Rael and soon realized, to her surprise, that Zester was jealous. However, she decided to ask why he paid so much attention to her, and if he was bothered by having such an unpredictable wife, half expecting a negative answer. She then remarked that it was good she talked in her sleep if it made her husband treat her kinder. Yet, Zester stated that her sleep talking hadn't influenced his behavior, though Kasia's reaction suggested she didn't believe him. Anxiously, Zester confessed he wasn't eloquent and might struggle to keep up a conversation, but he'd always make time for her. Even if he was slow to pick up on things and might not notice her feelings, he would try to improve. For 10 years, Kasia had lived with this man, and only upon returning and starting over did she see previously unnoticed aspects of his character. She began talking about how she liked this land, the kind people, the fresh air. She had no complaints, and Zester shouldn't worry so much. Furthermore, she mentioned that she'd someday like a son resembling Rael, trying to reassure her husband. She asked to postpone their trip by at least a week, reasoning that they had a guest, Drayan. Later, Kasia suggested they discuss all work-related matters after Viscount Havelon's departure, pleasantly surprising her husband with the idea. Then, with a flustered expression, Zester decided to say that he was incredibly fortunate to have such a wife, and while he felt inadequate in many ways, he would try his best. After Kasia had seen her husband, who was already concluding his speech outside the door, she felt the need to act and called for Paul. The butler hadn't expected an invitation from the lady of the house. Such a thing had never happened. But when he learned about her interest in Viscount Vish's request for support, everything started to make sense. Meanwhile, Kasia expressed her concerns about the agreement, believing the proposed payment was too low. Paul confirmed that the compensation offered by the Viscount was indeed insufficient. A significant issue was that Zester, as a mercenary, had worked for Vish for a long time, which was a major reason for the modest compensation. Now, having learned all the details of the contract, the Baroness planned to personally address the financial issues. This delighted the butler, who felt helpless in influencing his master regarding military matters. Kasia thought that perhaps she had been remiss in not delving deeper into her husband's work, even though she had suspected the reasons for the land's poverty. However, Viscount Vish was overstepping his bounds, having decided that Grease wasn't good enough for him to engage with in a manner that was deemed appropriate. Regarding Vish, it can be described as an expansive fertile land in the north that was frequently subjected to raids in the past. However, it is known that this winter, the Rakan clan, which could control monsters, attacked the local residents near the Basque mountain range and has since shown no intention of leaving. Despite their limited numbers, they posed a severe threat, for the 3-meter-tall creatures resembling wolves were not only terrifying but also dangerous. Without the aid of recruited knights, Viscount Vish was powerless and could only seek assistance from someone like Baron Grease. The man was reading a letter from the wife of the Imperial Hound and was infuriated, as she wrote expressing dissatisfaction with the compensation and requested a revision of the amount. The Viscount was reluctant to pay more, although even his aide believed the amount was insufficient. Such remarks only further enraged him. Vish's cunning knew no bounds. He wanted to meet the lady face to face and use his business acumen to pin her down, ensuring she had no further queries. He considered Baron Grease to be his loyal servant, and glancing at the letter, he was not keen on relinquishing control to someone else. Consequently, he sat down to pen a reply. Kasia was contemplating the Viscount Vish's proposal for a personal meeting. Paul believed it boded ill. The young lady felt that her opponent wanted to persuade her otherwise. Her certainty that he underestimated young women made him seem like a rogue unfamiliar with the basics of negotiation. Ultimately, the Baroness decided to accept the invitation, which meant she had to inform her husband that they would be journeying together. However, Zester was adamantly against it, not wanting to take his wife to a place filled with monsters and wild animals. When Paul realized the futility of explaining that the lady would be in a castle far from the Basque mountain range, he suggested that Zester himself should speak with the Baroness, who was determined to accompany him. Meanwhile, Kasia went to Draen's room. He was hastily packing, and it turned out that one of the mana gems had gone missing. Viscount Havelon had personally secured all the valuable stones in the fortress and even used less powerful seals to lock the vault. Draen and his sister had checked several times, but now, upon receiving a message about the incident from Paul, Draen wasn't even sure if the gem had been stolen. When Kasia inquired about the magic sealed within the gem, the young man picked up a sheet of paper with text about a second chance, regrets, and the god of opportunities. Kasia began to suspect that the gem might have vanished after being used. If it was so hard to steal, it might have disappeared somewhere else. Havelon was somewhat puzzled by what Kasia meant, so she decided to elaborate on her assumption. For instance, they had a quarrel, and someone might have wanted to rectify it afterwards. The young lady reflected on how they had indeed severed ties over a decade ago, but now their relationship had been mended. She had been granted the power to turn back time. Draen saw the logic in her explanation and now also pondered the possibility that someone might have used the gem to travel back in time. Once everything was set right, the stone disappeared. Kasia was concerned about the incident and wasn't convinced that she had been transported to the past due to the gem's power. She asked her friend to keep her updated on the investigation's progress. The Baroness listened to her husband, who insisted that Vish was unsafe and he wouldn't let her go until the issue with the Rakan was resolved. No matter how much Kasia tried to persuade him, Zester was stubborn. He reassured her not to worry about the personal invitation, but Kasia, formerly known as Ruberno, stood her ground. She argued that they needed to hire soldiers and have the funds to pay them. Although they evidently had financial issues, the Baron told her not to fret over it. In response to her husband's obstinacy, Kasia raised multiple what-if scenarios, but he didn't heed her concerns and wanted to proceed as he had initially planned. This time, Lady Florent was meeting with Paul, as the Baron was preoccupied with preparations for the expedition. The only matter at hand was to inform her that her services were no longer required. The butler apologized for any inconvenience, and after their discussion, he accepted a box of chocolates the woman had brought as a gift for the Baron. She mentioned that they were best paired with wine and suggested creating a romantic ambience before heading to bed. Despite the hints in her voice and her belief that if the Baron didn't catch on, the butler surely would enlighten him, Paul, having lost his wife, had become somewhat indifferent to such matters. Kasia intended to have a serious conversation with Zester about the troops, so she went to his room. The man was already preparing to join her in her chambers for the night, but she stated that she would stay in his instead. She informed him that Draen was set to leave the next morning after breakfast and wanted the Baron to see him off. After that, she initiated a more grave discussion. Everything began similarly to their daytime conversation, but now Kasia wanted to express her concerns regarding her husband's safety. The agreement they were entering into offered no guarantees. What would become of her and their lands if he did not return?